Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants and the call is currently being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And I would now like to turn the conference over to Michael Hawes. Thank you. You may begin.
Great. Thank you, operator. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the latest in our webinar series on understanding the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System. This month, the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, or DSEP, will be making determinations on the privacy loss budget and system parameters to be used for the production run of the Public Law 94-171 redistricting data summary file. Now, we've gotten a lot of questions about how DSEP will be making this decision and what information they will be considering in their deliberations. Most of the inputs to that decision-making will be a variety of accuracy metrics that we've developed in consultation with our stakeholders, as well as the feedback and analyses that we've been receiving based on the April 2021 demonstration data that we released. But to properly evaluate the privacy and accuracy trade-off that they're going to have to make, it's also really helpful to consider what the alternatives would look like were we to use a different form of disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census. So to contextualize that, we've conducted over the past year and a half, we've conducted some extensive research on what the privacy and accuracy consequences of different disclosure avoidance methods would be. So the presentation today will examine the results of some of that research into alternatives to differential privacy that DSEP will be considering as they make their determinations about the system parameters to be used for the production run of the redistricting data. Before I start, I want to thank my many colleagues at the Census Bureau and our external partners who have contributed to much of the information that we've been sharing throughout this webinar series. And I'd also especially like to thank our many external stakeholder groups who have been providing invaluable feedback throughout the entire process that has helped us to improve our disclosure avoidance system over the past couple of years. I also want to state that any opinions and viewpoints that are expressed today are entirely the opinions of the speakers and do not represent the opinions or viewpoints of the U.S. Census Bureau. Now, throughout the presentation, you're welcome to submit questions. Please use the Q&A feature in the WebEx platform. And my colleagues, Jen Shopcorn, Megan Mowry, and Michelle Hedrick, and I will be answering some of those during the presentation. And then we'll have time at the end to answer any remaining questions that you might have. So jumping in, the selection and implementation of any disclosure avoidance method imposes a fundamental trade-off between privacy and accuracy. These impacts on the usability of data aren't a byproduct of confidentiality protection. They're the mechanism by which you protect privacy and confidentiality. And you can think of this as a spectrum between one extreme where you have perfect privacy with useless data and the other extreme where you have perfect data with no privacy protections at all. And ultimately, you need to find a point in between those two extremes where the data are going to be sufficiently protected while also being sufficiently accurate. Once you've identified that point between those extremes, that becomes known as your privacy loss budget, and you'll hear us refer to that as PLB, for privacy loss budget, or represented by the Greek letters epsilon or rho, depending on the context. Now, determining that ideal point in between those extremes where the data are sufficiently protected and sufficiently accurate is a policy decision, and it's a difficult and challenging policy decision at that, because it requires weighing countervailing responsibilities that we have as an agency to produce high-quality data while also meeting our legal and ethical obligations to protect the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data. Now, in making that determination of where on that spectrum to be, you have to use a lot of different factors. As I mentioned before, DSEP will be considering a broad and diverse array of accuracy measures that we've developed, both those included in the detailed summary metrics that we published with our April 2021 demonstration data, but also additional accuracy metrics that we've developed specifically for the Redistricting and Voting Rights Act use cases, as well as accuracy targets related to many of our demographic programs that use census data, including our population estimates program. But in addition to evaluating all of those accuracy measures, we'll also be evaluating privacy impacts, both in terms of the privacy guarantee that could be afforded by various levels of privacy loss budget, and by the comparisons that we can make to similar privacy protections with different types of disclosure avoidance applied. So the point of today's presentation, as I mentioned before, is to look at, okay, what would the impact on privacy and what would the impact on accuracy and availability of data be if we were using a different disclosure avoidance method in place of the 2020 disclosure avoidance system that we have. And being able to make those comparisons allows us to contextualize those trade-offs that we have to make in the subsequent days and weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Rolando Rodriguez, who is going to walk through the results of the research that our teams have done on this subject. Rolando?
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll start off with a bit of background on the DAS reconstruction team and the efforts that team has made over the past year and a half. Next slide. Oh, we skipped one, Michael. So the DAS reconstruction team is a separate team from either the DAS science or DevOps teams. Those teams are working steadily to finalize the implementation of the top-down algorithm for use in 2020 census production as our means of providing privacy to our respondents. So back in February of last year, a group in the Center for Enterprise Dissemination Disclosure Avoidance area was assembled to begin to assess the potential impacts of swapping using an algorithm based upon the 2010 swapping algorithm. That team has since become the DAS reconstruction team. We performed numerous of these swapping experiments, and we have also begun preliminary assessments of the potential impact of cell and table suppression on 2010 data. Next slide. So I'll start off talking about suppression and the tests we have done there. These experiments involved 1980 census suppression rules, which was the last census we actually used suppression as the main means of disclosure avoidance. And these are based upon OMB race categories that I'll describe in a second. Next slide. So what is suppression? So suppression involves the removal of information from published tables in order to help protect privacy. So in the 1980 census, there are two kinds of suppression used. Table suppression, so the whole removal of tables from publication, and cell suppression, where particular cells in certain tables are suppressed to provide privacy. Typically, cell suppression is the harder type of suppression to implement due to the need for what we call complementary cell suppression, which I'll explain here. Next slide. So when you do suppression, you have some kind of rule. So here we have a 2A table and its associated margins that are going to be released. We may have a rule that say any cell that has fewer than a count of 5 associated with it will be suppressed. So in this table, we would take the 2 here and replace it with a suppression value here in S. In the 1980 census, they used a 0. But the thing is, we're not done here. This is what we call only a primary suppression. Next slide. Turns out that primary suppressions aren't enough to provide the kinds of protections that you want from a suppression method on cells. In this case, since we are publishing the margins of this table, you can take the margins and do just simple arithmetic to get back the value of S. So what you have to do, you have to make what are called complementary suppressions to support the actual suppression of the cell you want. In this case, because we have a 2A table and we have all the margins published, you actually have to end up suppressing the entire set of 2A cells. Next slide. So for the suppression test, the DAS reconstruction team assessed the impact of 1980-based suppression rules. So the counterfactual world here is that we have suppression rules based upon the 1980 census. We have race and ethnicity categories given by OMB, and we're applying these to the PL94171 redistricting tables and the summary 1 file tables from the 2010 census. So these are based upon the 2010 census edited file. So the race categories I have listed here, as I said, given by OMB and implemented by the Department of Justice voting section. There are 7 major race categories, either alone or in combination with white, but the remainder 2 or more race category. And then for ethnicity, we have a simple Hispanic or non-Hispanic binary classification. Next slide. So as far as the rules for the 1980 census and suppression, there were a couple of rules that were germane to the PL94 tables. For table suppression, the rule is that whole tables were suppressed, that is, they weren't published at all, for any geography that had between 1 and 14 persons in any of the race or race by ethnicity groups. So this applies to 2 tables, tables P3, which is race for the voting age population, and table P4, which is race by Hispanic or Latino origin for the voting age population. The other rule that applied was self-suppression of counts of 1 or 2. Those were suppressed and marked as 0. There was a flag to indicate which zeros were actual sampling zeros and those that were zeros from suppression. That applied to 2 tables, tables P1, which is race alone, and table P2, which is ethnicity by race. Additionally, for the SF1 tables from 2010, we looked at a table suppression rule from 1980 that said that any table that wasn't dedicated solely to race or ethnicity would be suppressed if the geography associated with that table had between 1 and 14 persons. So it's a simple suppression rule based upon total population. That applies to all person-level tables from the SF1. Next slide. So I want to talk a bit about the impact that these suppression rules would have on privacy risk. So with suppression, if it's done correctly, you actually do remove information from the tables that are released. If you do enough of this suppression, you can prevent particular attacks, for instance, like the reconstruction embedded re-identification attack that we performed in the 2010 census. And while we can eliminate the risk of specific attacks, this wouldn't be equivalent to the kinds of broad privacy protections that are associated with formal privacy definitions, like the one being used for the 2020 top-down algorithm. Next slide. So to get some actual results here, I have a summary of results of, this is cell suppression for tables P1 and P2 out of the PL94 171 products for 2010. Again, this is using race categories from OMB. These are only the primary suppressions for the cells that I'm showing. I'll note that the margin of these 2 tables, P1 race and P2 Hispanic by race, so the total, this population margin there was always reported under the 1980 rules. So again, we would need complementary suppression above these numbers. So what we see here is that at the county level for table P1, 2.4% of the cells will require suppression, reaching a max of 10.1% of the cells at the block group level. Table P2, since it crosses table P1 by another variable, will have more cell suppression that would need to be applied. At the county, 6.8% of cells up to a maximum of 14.5% of cells at the block group level. Next slide. More interesting, perhaps, is the effect of table suppression. So tables P3, which is race for the voting age population, and tables P4, which is race by ethnicity for the voting age population, since those cross race or ethnicity by another demographic, in this case age, they would have had table suppression applied in 1980. So we show here some of the results for potential suppression under these rules. We see for table P3, at the county level, almost over 50% of the tables would have to be suppressed, reaching a maximum of 95.7% of tables at the block group level. Again, for table P4, since it crosses the previous table with another variable, in this case is now race by ethnicity, it would be even a larger amount of table suppression would have been necessary. At the county level for table P4, 84.2% of tables would have been suppressed, of the P4 tables, that is, reaching basically almost all the tables at the block group level would have needed suppression. This is a large amount of suppression that would have been necessary under these rules, especially for on-spine geographies lower than the county level. Next slide. We did consider there was not a cell suppression rule for tables P3 and P4 in 1980, but we did consider if there were, what would have been the implications. So again, here we have these would be primary cell suppressions. And similar story to tables P1 and P2. For table P3, at the county level, 3.7% of cells would be suppressed, up to a maximum of 13.5% at the block group level. Table P4, again, that's Hispanic or Latino by race for the voting age population. Over 9% of cells at the county level will be primary suppressions, up to a maximum of 17.6% at the block group level. Next slide. As I said before, we additionally looked at rules that would have affected other SF1 tables. So these are tables including finer breakdowns of rate of sex and age. We looked at the potential impact on both the person level tables and the house unit level tables. The rule for housing level tables was that if you had between 1 and 4 occupied housing units in a geography, the SF1 tables for that geography would be suppressed. So as we see here, so again, this is table suppression for SF1 tables based upon the 1980 suppression rules. For blocks of 38.7% of the SF1 of the blocks would need to have their SF1 table suppressed. For the housing units at the block, again, 32.8% of blocks would have to have their housing unit SF1 table suppressed under these rules. And you can see here too that there are additionally some need for a little bit of table suppression at block group tables and tract level SF1 tables as well. Next slide. So those are results related to suppression. I'll now move on to showing some of our results related to swapping. These are relaxations and extensions of the swapping algorithm that was used for the 2010 census. Next slide. So just for a little overview of how swapping works, you first have to determine a key that's going to let you match units. Those units will be the swap partners with each other. So they're matched on a certain key. You have to choose which geographies you're going to swap between and that you'll swap within. So as I have illustrated here, we're using a matching key of the number of people in a household. We're swapping between blocks but within, say, tract, county, or state. You then determine which units you want to swap. That then feeds into the calculation of the swap rate that you want. So what percentage of the housing units in this case would be swapped. And then you find pairs. And after you find a pair, you swap the pair. So this moves households between geographies, and in that way tries to provide some amount of privacy. Next slide. So initial efforts from the DAS reconstruction team focused on taking the 2010 swapping algorithm and making it support high swap rates up to 100% if necessary. So we made those changes. So the algorithm as we have it now accepts a few parameters. One is the desired swap rate, so now anywhere between 0 and 100%. It looks at invariance, so that this key that you want to be constant between the households that you're swapping. And then we have mechanisms for relaxing those invariants and extending our swaps beyond the tract, because often swaps end up happening within tract under this algorithm. Next slide. So we've prepared numerous iterations of these swapping experiments at this point. We've tested swap rates ranging from 5% to 50% of housing units. We've applied pre-swap perturbation to household size of up to +1 or -1 for up to 80% of housing units. We've applied pre-swap perturbation of tract, either within county or within state, to housing for up to 70% of the housing units. Then at the beginning of this year, we began to set the impact that these parameters have on the reconstruction embedded re-identification attack that had been previously done on the 2010 census. Next slide. So what are the key outcomes of these swapping experiments? Well, one is that low swap rates have had essentially no impact on our re-identification outcomes. They stay essentially the same as they were for the original 2010 SF1 experiment. High swap rates had a minimal impact on re-identification outcomes, but had accuracy metrics significantly inferior to those out of the latest DAS PPMF test released in April. Put those together, that implies that there's some middling swap rate where we might be able to match the top-down algorithm in terms of accuracy on particular outputs, but we're going to have low impact from swapping on reducing re-identification risk, at least in these scenarios. So to give some particular results here, as to recall what happened for the 2010 original experiment, we had a putative population re-identification rate of 44.6%. A confirmed percent across the population of 16.85%. That gives us a precision, so that is the relative amount of confirmation to the putative re-identifications of 37.79%. I have here two swap experiments, one I'm calling swap low, one I'm calling swap high. Swap low is a 5% swap with no perturbation of household size or tract. Swap high was a 50% swap with 50% of the households having their household size perturbed pre-swap and 70% of them having their tract perturbed pre-swap. For the swap low experiment, you can see the putative and confirmed rates basically mirror those from the original experiment, meaning the precision also stays the same. For the swap high experiment, a definite decrease in putative and confirmation rates, but that only a putative rate down to 42.69% and a confirmation rate in the population down to around 13%, which means our precision still stays above 30%. Next slide. So then looking at some of the impact on accuracy of these swap experiments, I have here mean absolute error for the total population in the county or total population for incorporated places. You can see here I have the April PPMF release, the swap high and the swap low experiments. You can see that the errors from the swap high experiment dwarf those from either of the others. And again, that had some but pretty minimal impact on our re-identification outcomes. Next slide. We also broke this down for race alone categories at the county level. So this again, mean absolute error. We see the same story again. Swap low and the April PPMF are basically both invisible on this scale. The errors from swapping 50% of house units. It's just incredibly high for these kinds of outcomes. Next slide. So just some final considerations to take away. None of these algorithms, either the suppression or the swapping algorithms, adheres to a formal privacy definition or semantic for privacy loss, like the ones that are being used for the 2020 top-down algorithm. We are only assessing them on this one particular attack strategy, the 2010 Census Reconstruction Embedded Re-Identification attack. The Census Scientific Advisory Committee recently stated, of course, that this was a conservative attack, and even using just our own census data, we could do a much more specific attack than this. The implementation of the 1980 census suppression rules would lead to extreme amounts of table suppression for the substate on-spine geography, so county, tract, block, and block groups. If we implemented relaxations or extensions of the 2010 census swapping algorithm, that would yield little improvement in our re-identification outcomes, at least for the particular experiment we did on 2010. And the accuracy outcomes at the high swap rates would be significantly inferior to those out of the current DAS. And the final note here, any production implementation of either a suppression or a swapping algorithm would be expected to take at least an additional 6 months after a decision would be made to implement them. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Rolanda. Before we open things up for some of the questions that have been coming in during the Q&A, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you're interested in staying informed about our work on the disclosure avoidance system and our modernization of disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census and for our other censuses and surveys, please sign up for our newsletter. You can find that on census.gov if you search disclosure avoidance. Also, check out our webpage. We have lots of great information there. We have issue papers, frequently asked questions, fact sheets, videos, and much, much more if you want to learn more about what the work is that we've been doing and stay attuned to newest updates. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Megan Maury, who is going to moderate our Q&A. Megan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michael. And actually, this first question is for you, even though I see that you were just moved off the stage. A couple of folks had asked about something that you talked about in the intro, which is they were asking about the decision-making process that's happening right now around the epsilon and allocation of the PLB. Can you just revisit that and maybe talk a little bit about what happens, how that whole process works?
Sure. So as I mentioned, DCEP is expected to make their determinations for privacy loss budget and system parameters this month, and that decision making is currently underway. Once DCEP has decided on the privacy loss budget, the allocation of the privacy loss budget, and the other system parameters for the production run of the redistricting data product, those specifications will be given to the disclosure avoidance system team for implementation in the production environment that will be used. Then we will be doing the actual production run of the redistricting data. The output of that is the microdata detail file. That microdata detail file will then go through extensive quality assurance evaluation by our demographic directorate. And that essentially serves several purposes, but primarily is to make sure that the implementation of the parameter settings that DCEP selected were properly implemented and didn't result in any errors or unexpected consequences. So there's this QA period in there to make sure that the data are behaving as expected. At that point, they then feed into tabulation. They'll be tabulated, and then that moves towards the August 16th release of the redistricting data product in the legacy file format and the September 30th release of the redistricting data in the data.census.gov platform. Parallel to those final stages of the process, the disclosure avoidance system team will also be generating a new set of demonstration data based on the 2010 census, run through the algorithm with the final parameters and settings as implemented in the MDF that becomes the official 2020 redistricting data product. And so we'll be releasing that additional set of demonstration data using the 2010 data with the final 2020 production settings in September, and that will allow data users to evaluate the anticipated accuracy of the actual 2020 redistricting data product.
Awesome. And one follow-up question to that before I come over to you, Rolando, with a bunch of fun questions about suppression and swapping. The one follow-up that I saw in the Q&A was, can you say what you mean by parameters that DCEP is considering?
Sure. So for those of you who attended our webinar on the mechanics of the top-down algorithm, the algorithm is incredibly flexible. And in fact, it has nearly infinite tuning parameters that can be used to prioritize accuracy and really tune in on specific accuracy targets for any given statistic, or to tune in for privacy protections for any particular statistic or attribute. And so there's lots of these different dials or settings that have to be made within the system. The most obvious is, of course, the overall privacy loss budget to be used. But then there's also the privacy loss budget allocation. How much do you assign to tabulations at the national level versus the state, tract, block group, or block levels? How much do you assign to the different queries that support the production of the data? So how much do you assign to queries on total population versus queries on race or race by Hispanic origin? How much do you put towards the full detailed table, which is every variable by every other variable? And those ratios determine the relative accuracy of the different sets of tabulations at the different levels of geography. Then you also have additional parameters that we've talked about in prior webinars, including aspects of the geographic hierarchy, the actual query strategies that are used to support the processing in the DAS, and much, much more. So when I say the system parameters, that's kind of shorthand for many of those individual little dials and settings that can have implications on that fine-tuning of the algorithm to meet a very precisely kind of calibrated privacy accuracy trade-off.
Thank you. Very helpful. And Rolando, this one's for you, and it's my favorite question, which is what does perturbed mean in the context of these swapping studies?
Right. So when we say we perturbed housing unit size pre-swap, what that means is that we gave some probability that any given housing unit will have its value of size changed by plus or minus 1 in this case. So, if we did 80% of housing units that get perturbed, that means we have some split of that 80, say 40-40, where 40% go to plus 1 and 40% go to minus 1. So that means that they're matching based upon a housing unit size that is not their own originally. For the geographic perturbation, we take pre-swap, we give some probability that the tract associated, or block or tract, or whichever geography you want, that's associated with the housing unit gets changed to another geography within geography that we're doing. So in this case, if we're perturbing tracts, we have some probabilities that given a housing unit, we'll change them to have a tract that's different from the one it had originally, which means that they can now they will swap based upon that, what we call pseudo tract. So there it is actually possible they might go back to their original tract, but there is a perturbation.
Got it. And that connects into another question that I saw in the Q&A, which is they were asking that question, didn't swapping keep the counts invariant at the block group or block or tract level? And I think the answer is you tested the perturbation at different levels of geography to see how that would impact these analyses. Is that right?
That's right. Well, one of the analyses we did had no perturbation, so that would hold. In this case, the only thing that would be maintained would be the housing unit size between the housing units. But we did have to maintain, for instance, like voting age population, I believe, in 2010. So there were definitely invariants that were required of the swapping algorithm, just as for the top-down algorithm in 2020.
Got it. And then I think a pretty connected question here is that in this presentation, you provided results about mean average error for county and place. Is there anything that you could tell us about the accuracy at the tract, block group, or even block levels for those? So as Michael said, the main reason for this was to help inform DCEP in terms of their decision on privacy loss budget. When we run the swaps, we run the entire set of accuracy metrics that are run for the 2020 DAS experiments. But we haven't released any of those other than the ones we have here publicly currently. Got it. There's a question in the Q&A about, there's so many in here, I'm trying to pull ones that we're getting multiple times, but there's a question here about, did you test the re-identification and reconstruction risk for the 1980 suppression rules? Or was there another way you were analyzing risk of re-identification for those experiments?
Right. So understand with the suppression experiments, we didn't actually perform suppression. We assessed how often the rule would be applied. So in fact, one of the difficulties and why these kinds of things would take at least 6 months is that if we implemented suppression, we would actually do suppression, which means we would need software to perform all the complementary suppressions, and that is a hard task. So no, we were not able to perform the same kind of analyses on the suppression tables.
Got it. There are a couple questions in here that are really legal questions, and I know that neither of you are attorneys, so I'm going to put those to the side for now and say that if folks do have questions about legal matters, feel free to email us. We'll answer if we can, as I'm sure that most of the folks on the call know we're not able to speak to current litigation matters. So to the extent that you're asking a question that's directly related to that, it's a little tough for us to answer. But we will answer if we can, and certainly we'll provide you links to information that's on our website that might help answer your legal questions on the Census Bureau's and the laws and statutes that guide our work. many other questions in here. Let me just try to get some easy ones out of the way. One of the questions is, have the current demonstration data products, the PPMS that we've released, have those been reviewed by our demographic directorate? And if so, can we see the results of those analysis in some way?
So yes, not just the data that have been released as demonstration data files, but also many of the other experimental runs of the disclosure avoidance systems top-down algorithm that we've been performing over the last many months. In fact, the demographic director, and particularly the population division, have been enormously active in the ongoing discussions and tuning and tweaking of the algorithm's design throughout the process, and we would not be where we are without their subject matter expertise. The majority of the analysis that the demographic directorate has done has focused on the various measures that are reflected in the detailed summary metrics that are included with the release of each PPMS. And they generate those for the other experimental runs that we do as well. Now, these runs, the ones that are released to the public are cleared for public release by our Disclosure Review Board. The other internal runs are not. They are still Title 13 protected until they've gone through DRB review. So those analyses that are being done on the interim kind of experimental runs of the DAS are T13 protected. I don't know if there are plans for a broader release of kind of analysis of some of those runs, but yeah, the demographic directorate has been quite active in reviewing all of the measures that are included in the detailed summary metrics, and then many more beyond that.
Fantastic, super helpful. So wait, Michael, if I wanted to see those detailed summary metrics that the demographic directorate has created, how would I do that?
Absolutely. So again, if you go to our website, census.gov, and search disclosure avoidance, on the main disclosure avoidance, modernizing the 2020 disclosure avoidance system webpage, there's a link to data metrics, demonstration data metrics, and that is the link to where all of our demonstration data products reside. The most recent being the April 2021 demonstration data products, but also links to all of the earlier versions if you want to do comparisons. And those demonstration data releases contain multiple files. There's the privacy-protected microdata file for the persons universe, the privacy-protected microdata file for the units universe, and the detailed summary metrics. Now, those detailed summary metrics, as I said, were generated based on the feedback that we got from many of our data users over the past couple of years on what measures would allow them to most readily assess fitness for use of the demonstration data to their specific use cases. So we've got numerous ways of measuring accuracy. So mean absolute error, mean absolute percent error, mean algebraic percent error. We've got measures of outliers and more. And that's at different levels of geography for different statistics. We then have specific accuracy measures that are for different types of use cases, like total error in allocated, total allocation error of shares, I think is the acronym, that looks at what the impact on funding decisions might be at various levels of geography and others. So now the detailed summary metrics do include measures for which there are no data currently. Many of these error measures were generated for use cases that are supported by the demographic and housing characteristics file, which the demonstration data that we've been releasing the last few cycles have been limited only to the redistricting data. So you'll see more of those error measures populated when we start, when we resume producing demonstration data for eventually for the DHC file, but all of the redistricting ones are also included.
Awesome. There's a question here about the global epsilon and the epsilon for geographic levels and queries. They're asking if there's a numerical relationship between global epsilon and that epsilon for the geographic levels and queries, but I wonder if you could just speak to it a little bit more generally. How can people take a look at that allocation and what else they might want to know.
Sure. So in that same location on our website where the detailed summary metrics are, there's actually a spreadsheet that gives the exact allocations that were used for the demonstration data runs. But effectively, the way you can think of it kind of in the abstract is you assign a value of epsilon to each data product. And those values together added up become your global privacy loss budget. But you assign a value of epsilon to a particular data product, like the redistricting file. Then when it's being run through the top-down algorithm, you divide that overall privacy loss budget for that data product into slices of the pie, into shares, with a certain share going to everything at the national level, a certain share going to everything at the state level, a certain share going to the county level, and so on, with all of those shares adding up to 100%. You similarly do a similar allocation of shares to the different sets of queries that get performed. And then the amount of privacy loss budget that's allocated to any particular query at any particular level of geography is essentially the share for the geographic level multiplied by the share for that particular query. Now, I say essentially because in reality, one of the major advantages of the top-down algorithm's design is that tabulations at lower levels of geography inherit accuracy from tabulations that have already been performed at higher levels. So if you're allocating certain shares to queries at the national level, queries at the state level are going to inherit some of that accuracy by virtue of the accuracy that's already been determined at the level above, and so on. So it's how much we're allocating to the processing and the noisy measurements at any given level, but the actual statistics are going to be more accurate than the allocation specifically.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I found it really helpful to look at that table that you mentioned to see sort of where the allocation falls and help me a little bit understand how the whole system works. So I highly recommend that. We're still getting a couple of questions about, is there more time to consider alternatives within the allocation to address some of the issues that people have raised in their feedback around outliers, et cetera. Again, still getting questions on, has DSEP made a final decision? Can we just revisit that one more time just to make sure?
Sure. So DSEP is still deliberating, as I mentioned before. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and for those who missed the beginning, one of the major sets of information that they're reviewing in their deliberations are the extensive and really valuable feedback that we've gotten from our data users on their analyses of the April 2021 demonstration data. So thank you to everyone who submitted those. They have all been looked at. Every single member of the DSEP has the complete compilation of all of the feedback that we received. And I know they're looking at it closely because I've been getting questions about it from many of them. So it is all being reviewed and it's being taken very seriously. As I mentioned, they're still making their deliberations on this. Those deliberations will likely conclude in the very near future. We have a production schedule, after all, leading us towards that April 16th release date for the redistricting data product. Again, they want to make sure that they do this right, so they're taking every piece of information they can and making sure that the parameter settings that they make are going to be the right ones, and then those get programmed into the system. We run it, we check it again. We have our demographic directorate do their thorough analysis, and then we release the data.
Thank you. Sorry, I apologize for coming back to that, but I think it's really important for people to sort of understand where we're at and make sure that they really know what the team is doing. Rolando, another question for you. There's a couple questions in here about whether you've conducted additional types of experiments, things that mix suppression and swapping, whether you're planning on releasing any results of these experiments at different levels of geography. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you all are thinking about that, if you all are thinking about that?
Well, I would say we know we have not combined assessing the impact of swapping plus suppression, simply because, as I said before, we haven't actually implemented suppression. We've assessed how much suppression would be needed. So we couldn't do that until we've actually implemented a suppression algorithm for 2010, which would be a major effort. I think that would be more effort than we're likely to be able to do if we're also going to have to implement one, say, for 2020. That being said, if there's great interest in really seeing outcomes associated with swapping experiments, that is something we can consider. But as I said before, the main purpose of these has been to inform the budgetary decisions that DSIP is trying to make right now.
And Megan, if I could add on to what Rolando was saying, because I think it's a point worth looking at about just how complicated suppression is as a methodology. Rolando touched on the idea that complementary suppressions are necessary in order to protect the data that you're suppressing. So you suppress the vulnerable cells in the table, but then you can, if you don't suppress additional cells, you can recalculate those suppressed values just by subtracting the other reported values from totals. That's just a fundamental requirement of suppression methodologies. But even more challenging in that, and the reason that it would be so difficult and time-consuming to implement a suppression strategy is the sheer complexity and interconnectedness of the census publications, the fact that different characteristics are disaggregated in different ways in different tables, and that all of these tables are nested within a geographically hierarchical structure. You have lots of different ways that values could be added up or subtracted. So you have to make sure that if you're suppressing a particular value, that not only do you have complementary suppressions in that particular table, but you also have to verify that you can't recalculate that suppressed value by swapping the reported data from the parent geography's value, or that you don't have another table at that level that disaggregates the data in a different way that could be used to subtract out the suppressed value and so on. And going through all of those possible relationships between those tables at all the different levels of geography to find all of your necessary complementary suppressions requires very complicated linear programming to accomplish. And if you miss even one of them, the whole thing can topple like a house of cards. So that's why it's such a complex process, and why we don't have those results that the question was just asking about.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really helpful because at a glance it seems like suppression would be pretty simple. You just say look for values below. X
it's really easy to do it wrong.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that, and I've seen lots of agencies at lots of different levels of government who have done their suppression wrong, and I've shown them just how easy it is to make that house of cards tumble down. So if you do it, you want to do it right, and that's what takes time and effort.
Yeah, thanks for that. Again, just one clarifying question, and I think I know the answer, but there's one more clarifying question about DSIP. The question was, will DSIP have access to the actual letters that were sent in? And the answer is yes. The compilation is the compilation of feedback. Of course, there's also I'm sure there's some summary information that you provided as well, but I think the questions you were talking about, that folks on DSIP are coming to you with questions. They're coming to you with questions on people's direct feedback, right?
Every member of DSIP has a copy of every single submission that we received.
Wow, it's a lot of reading. There are a couple questions in here about the re-identification, and there's a sort of a theme between them that I'm seeing, which is people are surprised by the fact that these swapping examples, like even at a 5% swap, there's so little impact on re-identification that might seem, not surprising to people, but that there was so little impact on reducing re-identification for those high swap rates. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
So we haven't assessed the particular swaps to see like where we're not getting reidentify and where we are. I mean, I think I will say that you do get a significant drop when you go to the 50%, just relative to what you get at say 5. It's just not proportional to the amount of swaps that you have done. That's likely related to just patterns within housing units, and that's something where we definitely could do a deeper look into. It's just numbers we haven't generated yet right now.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think most of the other questions in here, again, many of them touch on those legal components, and we'll leave those for our colleague attorneys to answer at another time. But I think there are some sort of forward-looking questions, too, and I don't know if y'all are the right people to answer them, but I'll throw them out and see if you feel like you have the information at your fingertips to provide any information. One of the questions is about the changes to DHC that are coming down the road. I think, as we've been talking to folks about disclosure avoidance, and they've been thinking about how the PL tables are related to the DHC tables, I think folks are curious about why the data that will be released under DHC in 2020 is different from the data that was released back in 2010 under SF1. And I know we don't have time to go into all the details, but if you could speak to that a little bit at a general level, if you have that information at your fingertips.
Sure. A member of our demographic directorate would be able to answer this much more thoroughly than I can, but there are changes to the publications with every census. Tables are added, tables are subtracted. This time around, we were more deliberate in our decisions about like what tables should be included, largely because when you are using a formally private mechanism of privacy loss accounting, any tabulation that you're producing uses up a share of your privacy loss budget. And so for any given level of privacy, the more tabulations you're producing, the less accurate the total will be. So you want to make sure that when you're spending privacy loss budget, because privacy and accuracy are both finite commodities at this time, when you're spending privacy loss budget, you want to make sure you're spending it in the most effective and efficient way possible. So one of the things our demographic directorate did as they began the planning for the 2020 census data products was look at the use cases that underlie all of the different tables that have been included. And they tried to essentially strip out of the plan tabulations for which there were no documented use cases. And that was much of what they were doing in terms of thinking about the structure of the 2020 data product. The other component of that is there are different ways of performing disclosure avoidance. And some are better for certain types of data, and other methods are better for other types of data. The same holds true for the algorithms that we're using for the 2020 disclosure avoidance system. The top-down algorithm is really good for producing formally private microdata that can feed into our tabulation systems. But as we've discussed in other contexts, that also imposes certain constraints on how the algorithm can work. There are other tabulations, for example, the person household joins, which many of our data users are interested in. Those are much better handled with other formally private algorithms. And so some of those, like householder characteristics tables, are being shifted to the later data products that will be protected using this other collection of formally private algorithms, rather than being included in the DHC where they would be subjected to the top-down algorithm.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense to me. Another sort of forward-looking question, and I'm pretty sure that you're not the right person to answer this, but I'm going to throw it out anyway just in case. Are we going to provide any kind of training? This person particularly asked about, for those folks who are involved in redistricting, on how to understand the accuracy metrics and how that might impact their work. They're not necessarily statisticians, so they might not be able to digest the metrics quite as easily how are we hoping to make sure that people understand how to use this data?
So
if you have anything.
That's a great question, and there's a few pieces there that I can point people to, and an action item I can take back to the census. So for starters, I would say if you're interested in learning how to interpret the accuracy measures that we've included in the detailed summary metrics, I would point you to the webinar that we did a couple weeks ago with our colleague Matt Spence, where he walked through how to understand the different types of accuracy measures in the detailed summary metrics and how to navigate that file. I think that's a really useful starting point. We also did the webinar with Tommy Wright and Kylie Ramada, where they walked through their analysis of specifically the redistricting use case in the context of the demonstration data. That was a little more technical, or depending on who you are, a lot more technical, and might not be as accessible for somebody without a statistical background. Separate from that, we are working with the Population Reference Board, PRB, to develop a handbook that will accompany the redistricting data product that will explain a lot of what we've done with the disclosure avoidance system and how the top-down algorithm works and what the implications of differentially privacy loss accounting are in this context. So that handbook, I think, will be a really useful tool for understanding the implications of all of this for the redistricting use case specifically. So there's a lot of pieces there, but to the part of the question about will we be doing more training on it, that's a great question, and it's something that I will certainly consider, and I'll bring back and see what we can do.
Yeah, and I will say, as someone who lives a bit more in the communications world, part of what we're hoping to hear from data users over the coming months before that data is released is what kinds of trainings and information would be most useful for folks when we do release that data. I know we've got Jen Shopcourt on the line, as well as Shelley, who are thinking about these things as well. So we appreciate it as communications folks. We appreciate that question. There are additional questions in here. Again, I just want to reiterate that CSEP is looking at feedback from everyone who submitted it. There's no piece of feedback that they're not considering to be part of their of what they need to think about and analyze as they move through their deliberation process, as Michael just mentioned. We have just another moment. Michael, Rolando, I just wanted to give you a second if there was anything you wanted to wrap us up with, or anything you wanted to make sure folks heard before we sign off.
I would actually say one thing. We talked about the DHC briefly, and that's something that I know many of our data users care a lot about. We are in parallel with all of our work to get the redistricting data into production. We're also turning our attention towards tuning experiments for the demographic and housing characteristics file. And so if data users have particular use cases they're interested in there, or particularly accuracy targets that they think we should be tuning towards, please submit those as well. That input can be very helpful for us as we tune all those little dials and settings that I talked about before. So stay tuned for more on that, and if you have accuracy measures that you want to suggest, please submit those to the DHC, and we will take them into consideration.
Fantastic. Well, with that, Michael, I'm turning it back to you to wrap us up.
Great. Well, again, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This webinar will be posted onto our website if you want to go back to it. Please, again, sign up for our newsletter to stay informed of all the latest updates. And with that, it is now 3 o'clock, and I wish you all a great rest of your afternoon and happy weekend.